They didn't laugh because she was a woman. They laughed because the rifle she pointed at kicked hard enough to fracture a collarbone, and she barely weighed $130 soaking wet. But they didn't know about the titanium plates, and they certainly didn't know about the scar. The armory at Fort Irwin smelled of Hops No. 9 solvent, old sweat, and hot dust. The desert outside was currently baking at 110 degrees, pushing a dry wind that felt like the exhaust of a jet engine. Inside the corrugated tin building, a line of the military's most lethal personnel waited to draw their weapons. Claire stood near the back. She didn't shift her weight. She didn't lean against the wall. She just stood, staring at the scarred wooden counter, her face caked in a fine layer of pale dirt that made the dark circles under her eyes look bruised. She had earned her trident 3 years ago. The brass had paraded her around in press releases for a month, then finally let her disappear into the operational dark where she belonged. But this was the advanced, long-range sniper qualification. The men in this room weren't standard infantry. They were Rangers, Delta, and her own SEAL brethren. They respected the bird on her chest, sure. But respect only went so far when the physics of long-range ballistics were involved. Next, the armorer grunted, wiping a greasy rag across his hands. Claire stepped up. "Harper," the armorer checked his clipboard. "Got you down for the M2010, Chief. Good rifle, 300 Winchester Magnum. Forgiving on the shoulder, carries flat." He turned to grab the sleek, suppressed weapon from the rack. "No," Claire said. Her voice was flat, raspy from the dust. "I'm requesting the M107. The armorer paused, his hand hovering over the bolt action point 300 Win Mag. He turned back, his brow furrowed. "The Barrett?" "Yes." A low chuckle drifted from the back of the line. It wasn't a malicious sound. It was worse. It was pitying. Staff Sergeant Miller, an instructor who looked like he had been carved out of beef jerky and bad attitudes, stepped out from the shadows of the doorway. He crossed his arms. "Harper, you passed selection. You proved your point. But the .50 caliber isn't a statement piece. It's 35 pounds of steel that kicks like a pissed-off mule. You have to carry it 12 miles through the sand before you even set up your hide." "I'm aware of the weight, instructor," Claire said. She didn't turn to look at him. She kept her eyes on the armorer. "Are you?" Miller scoffed, stepping closer. "Because I don't care how many pull-ups you can do. It's simple mass. You fire 5 rounds of .50 BMG through that thing. Your shoulder is going to be ground meat. You won't be able to lift your arm to check your watch, let alone stay on the glass for a second shot. Take the .300. Save yourself the medical discharge. More snickers from the line." A few heads shook. "She's trying too hard," their body language said. "She's got a chip on her shoulder." Claire finally turned. She looked at Miller, then at the men behind him. She didn't puff out her chest. She didn't raise her voice. "I requested the M107. Miller stared at her for a long, quiet moment. He chewed the inside of his cheek. "Give her the Barrett," he told the armorer. "When she drops it on the ruck march, leave it in the dirt." The armorer shrugged and hauled the massive rifle onto the counter. It hit the wood with a heavy, metallic thud. It looked absurdly large next to her. The barrel alone was almost as tall as her chest. Claire didn't hesitate. She grabbed the carry handle, hoisted the 35-pound weapon, and slung it over her back. The sling dug instantly into her collarbone. The weight dragged at her spine. She felt the familiar, sharp twinge in her right shoulder, a phantom echo of an old, very real agony. She ignored it. She turned and walked out the door into the blinding desert sun. Behind her, the murmurs started up again. Bets were already being placed on what mile marker she'd quit. The firing line was a stretch of hard-packed earth overlooking a valley that shimmered with intense heat mirage. At 1,500 yards, The steel targets looked like specks of rust floating in a blurry ocean. The ruck march had been brutal. 12 miles over broken terrain. Claire's boots were coated in white dust. Her fatigues were soaked through with sweat, clinging to her frame. The Barrett had battered her spine with every step, the metal receiver grinding against her lumbar. But she hadn't dropped it. She hadn't fallen behind. Now they were setting up their hides. The instructors walked the line with spotting scopes. Then a convoy of 3 black SUVs rolled up 100 yards behind the firing line. The doors opened and the atmosphere on the range instantly tightened. General Thomas Riker stepped out, 2 stars on his collar. He was a relic of the old wars, a man who had lost 2 fingers in Fallujah and still ran marathons. He was the commander of Joint Special Operations Command, and he rarely visited training ranges unless he was looking for someone specific. Miller straightened his posture, barking at the men to secure their gear. "Keep working," Riker's voice boomed, carrying over the wind. He walked up to the line, flanked by a nervous-looking base commander. "I'm just here to watch the tax dollars burn." Riker stopped a few yards behind Claire. He watched her as she laid out her mat and positioned the massive Barrett bipod in the dirt. "She the one who demanded the anti-materiel rifle?" Riker asked Miller quietly, though on the firing line, quietly was relative. "Yes, General," Miller said. "Chief Harper, she insisted." "She's tiny," Riker observed, his eyes narrowing behind dark sunglasses. "Physics is a bitch, Sergeant." "I told her that, sir." "Let's see if she listens to it," Riker said, crossing his arms. "Shooters, load and make ready," the tower blared over the loudspeaker. Claire slid a massive 5-round magazine into the magwell. It clicked into place with a heavy, satisfying metallic chunk. She racked the bolt back and let it slam forward, chambering around the size of a large carrot. She settled in behind the scope. Shooting a .50 caliber rifle is a violent experience. It requires a perfect pocket in the shoulder to absorb the recoil. If there is a gap, if the rifle isn't pulled tight against bone and muscle, the recoil will act like a battering ram, separating joints and snapping clavicles. Claire tucked the buttstock deep into her right shoulder. She adjusted her breathing. Inhale, exhale, pause. The crosshairs danced over the mirage, then settled. "Send it," the tower ordered. Claire squeezed the trigger. The muzzle brake vented a concussive blast of hot gas and dust sideways, kicking up a miniature sandstorm. The roar was deafening, a physical shockwave that punched everyone in the chest. The massive recoil drove the rifle violently backward. Claire's entire body jerked, but she rode the recoil perfectly, her shoulder taking the brunt of the kinetic energy. 3 seconds later, ding! A faint, high-pitched ring echoed back from the valley. "Center mass at 1,500 yards. Hit," the spotter called out, sounding mildly surprised. "Do it again," Miller muttered. "1 shot is luck. 5 is a broken shoulder." Claire cycled the bolt, breathed, fired. Another concussive blast, another brutal punch to her shoulder. Ding! She didn't stop. She didn't rub her shoulder. She didn't pause to stretch. She fired a 3rd time, a 4th, a 5th. Each blast rattled the teeth of the men standing nearby. Each time, the rifle slammed back into her right shoulder with the force of a car crash. When the bolt locked back on an empty magazine, Claire went completely still. 5 shots, 5 impacts. "Clear!" she yelled out, her voice steady. She stood up. The heat on the line was suffocating, trapped between the dirt and the sun. Without thinking about the men behind her, without considering the audience, Claire unbuttoned her heavy, sweat-drenched combat top to cool off. She pulled it off her shoulders, letting it hang from her waist by the sleeves, leaving her in an olive-drab, sleeveless, moisture-wicking shirt. She reached up with her left hand and rolled her right shoulder, trying to work out the stiffness. General Riker took a step forward. He froze. The silence that fell over the men closest to her wasn't gradual. It was immediate. It spread down the line like a contagion. Miller stopped chewing his cheek. The base commander lowered his clipboard, because now they could see her right shoulder. It wasn't just scarred, it was destroyed. A massive, jagged crater of twisted, silvery scar tissue dominated her deltoid and collarbone, spiderwebbing down her back and up her neck. It looked as though someone had taken an ice cream scoop to her flesh and then haphazardly glued it back together. Beneath the thin fabric of the undershirt, the sharp, unnatural angles of subcutaneous titanium plates pushed against her skin. It wasn't the shoulder of a sniper. It was the shoulder of someone who had caught a piece of shrapnel the size of a dinner plate. Someone who, by all medical texts, should not have a functioning right arm. Riker slowly took off his sunglasses. His eyes stayed glued to the ruined landscape of her shoulder. "Harper," Riker said. His voice was entirely different now. It was barely above a whisper, completely stripped of its previous casual arrogance. Claire turned, blinking sweat from her eyes. "General?" Riker pointed a missing finger at her shoulder. "Kunar Province 3 years ago. Operation Red Dawn." Claire's posture didn't change. She just looked at him. "Yes, sir." "You were the point man," Riker said, the pieces clicking together in his head. The classified reports, the medevac request he had personally authorized for a SEAL who had thrown herself onto a rigged door to shield her squad from the blast. "They told me that operator was medically retired. They told me that operator's arm was held together by wire and screws." "It is, sir," Claire said simply. The men around them stared. Miller looked from the scar to the massive .50 caliber rifle and back to the scar. The math didn't work. The physics didn't make sense. The pain she must have just endured to fire 5 rounds of .50 BMG into a shoulder composed of metal plates and dead nerves was unfathomable. "Why?" Riker asked, his voice thick with an emotion he rarely showed. "Why the Barrett? You could have taken the .300. You could have saved yourself the agony." Claire looked down at the massive iron weapons sitting in the dust, then back up at the general. "Because, sir," Claire said, wiping a streak of dirt from her jaw, "the 300 doesn't stop a technical truck at a mile out, and out there, the enemy doesn't care if my shoulder hurts." Nobody laughed. Not a single sound was made on the firing line, except for the wind howling over the hot iron of the rifle. General Riker did not stay on the firing line. He turned on his heel and walked back to his SUV, his face an unreadable mask of weathered lines. He didn't offer Claire a salute, and he didn't offer her a handshake. In this world, pity was an insult, and awe was a liability. He simply got in the vehicle and left, but the silence he left behind lingered. Miller stood there for a long time, watching the dust settle where the SUVs had been. Then he turned back to the line. The other shooters were staring at Claire. Some looked away when she caught their eye. Others just stared at the metallic jaggedness of her right shoulder, trying to reconcile the horrific injury with the steady, violent accuracy she had just displayed. "All right, enough sightseeing," Miller barked. His voice lacked its usual venom. It was strictly business. "Police your brass. Get your rifles cleaned. We go out under nods at 0200. Claire quietly pulled her combat shirt back on. The fabric dragged over the scarred flesh, sending a dull, sickening throb down her tricep. She buttoned it up to her collar, hiding the metal, hiding the history. She didn't look at the men around her. She picked up her empty brass, hot to the touch, and dropped it into her dump pouch. That evening, the desert temperature plummeted. The brutal, suffocating heat of the day gave way to a biting chill that seeped into the bones. For Claire, the cold was worse than the heat. The titanium plates screwed into her collarbone and scapula held the cold, turning the metal inside her body into a block of ice. She sat cross-legged on her bunk in the open bay barracks. The only light came from the dim red tactical bulbs overhead. The air smelled of carbon, CLP oil, and the unwashed exhaustion of 30 men. Claire had the massive bolt assembly of the M107 broken down on a rag in front of her. She worked methodically. Her left hand did most of the heavy lifting. Her right hand guided the brush, picking carbon out of the extractor groove. Every rotation of her right wrist caused a sharp pulling sensation in her chest. The nerves in her shoulder had been severed and stitched back together, creating a chaotic wiring board of phantom pain and numbness. Sometimes her fingertips tingled. Sometimes they felt like they were on fire. A shadow fell over her bunk. She didn't look up, keeping her eyes on the firing pin she was wiping down. "Chief," a voice said. It was Hayes, a ranger, young, built like a linebacker, and one of the guys who had been making bets on when she'd quit. He stood awkwardly at the foot of her bunk, holding a small chemical heat pack. "What is it, Hayes?" Claire asked, her voice quiet in the hushed barracks. He held out the heat pack. I saw you rolling your neck out there. My brother caught some shrapnel in Syria. He says the cold makes the metal ache. Figured you might need this more than me." Claire finally looked up. Hayes wasn't mocking her. He looked genuinely uncomfortable, shifting his weight from boot to boot. The arrogance from the morning was completely gone, replaced by a cautious, deeply ingrained respect. "I have my own," Claire said. "Take it anyway," Hayes insisted, dropping it onto the edge of her mattress. He hesitated. "Hey, Chief." "Yeah, I was a dick today. We all were." He looked at the massive pieces of the Barrett spread out before her. "We didn't know." "You still don't," Claire said flatly. She picked up the firing pin and slid it back into the bolt carrier. "Get some sleep, Hayes. We have a night stalk in 4 hours." Hayes nodded slowly. "Roger that." He turned and walked back to his rack. Claire stared at the heat pack for a moment. Then she cracked the internal vial, shook it until it grew warm, and slid it under her shirt, pressing it against the top of her shoulder. She closed her eyes and let out a long, slow breath as the heat sank into the bruised muscle and the cold metal. Miles away, in the Tactical Operations Center, General Riker sat at a folding table, bathed in the blue glow of a laptop screen. He was looking at Claire Harper's medical file. The X-rays were a horror show. The humerus had been fractured in 3 places. The clavicle was completely shattered. The scapula looked like a dropped dinner plate. The surgeon's report was 50 pages long, detailing the installation of a custom titanium plate, 18 screws, and miles of synthetic graft. Recommendation: immediate medical retirement, 100% disability. Patient will retain approximately 40% range of motion in the right arm. Heavy lifting prohibited. Recoil impact prohibited. Riker scrolled down to the fitness reports. Subject refused physical therapy limitations. Subject maxed physical readiness test, using modified push-up criteria approved by medical board. Subject appealed medical discharge. Appeal denied. Subject appealed to Secretary of the Navy. Appeal granted under provision of waiver. She had fought the entire United States military bureaucracy just to stay in a job that demanded she sleep in the dirt and carry an anvil on her back. Riker leaned back in his creaky folding chair and rubbed his eyes. He had spent his entire career sending young men and women into the dark. He knew what drove them: patriotism, brotherhood, adrenaline, escaping a bad hometown. But this was different. This wasn't just drive. It was an absolute refusal to be unmade by the violence she had absorbed. The door to the TOC opened, and Instructor Miller walked in. He held 2 cups of terrible coffee in styrofoam cups. He set one down in front of the general. "She's still cleaning that cannon," Miller said, taking a sip from his own cup. "Hasn't complained once." "She won't," Riker said, tapping the screen. "You see this X-ray, Miller? If you or I fired a .50 caliber with this architecture in our shoulder, we'd be in an operating room right now." "How is she doing it, sir?" "Pain tolerance," Riker said quietly, "and compartmentalization. She's built a wall in her mind between what her body feels and what her mission requires. But walls crack, Sergeant, even the thickest ones." Riker looked up at Miller. "Do not go easy on her tomorrow. If she breaks, she breaks. Better here than in a blind on a mountaintop in Yemen." "I don't plan on it, sir," Miller said. "Tomorrow is the gauntlet." The wind was howling at 25 miles per hour, kicking up a blinding curtain of fine sand that tasted like chalk. The sun was a pale, angry disk cutting through the dust storm. It was day 3, the final qualification, the gauntlet. The shooters were spread out across a ridgeline. They had been awake for 36 hours, conducting mock infiltrations, land navigation, and stress shoots. They were dehydrated, hungry, and battered. "Target 7, the tower crackled over the radio. "Vehicle engine block, distance 1800, unknown wind. You have 2 minutes to identify, range, and engage." 1,800 yards, over a mile. Down the line, the shooters with the .300 Win mags scrambled. At that distance, in a heavy crosswind, a .300 grain bullet was going to get pushed around like a paper airplane. And even if they hit the target, the kinetic energy remaining would likely just dent the heavy steel mock-up of the engine block. Claire was paired with Hayes as her spotter. They lay side by side in the dirt, a camouflaged netting draped over them to break up their outline. Claire's right side was completely numb. It had bypassed pain hours ago and settled into a dull, terrifying deadness. Her fingers felt like thick sausages. She had to visually watch her hand to make sure her index finger was resting properly on the trigger shoe. "Got it," Hayes called out, his eye pressed hard against the spotting scope. "White pickup truck chassis, peeking out from behind a concrete barrier. Only the front grille and the engine compartment are exposed." Claire tracked her scope across the valley. The mirage was violent, boiling upward like water in a pot, distorting the target. She found the white chassis. "Distance 1825, Hayes read off his laser rangefinder. He checked his Kestrel wind meter. "Wind is brutal, Chief. Full value from the 3 o'clock. Call it 20, gusting to 28. Claire's mind clicked into the cold, calculated realm of ballistics. She didn't feel the sand in her teeth. She didn't feel the aching throbbing in her collarbone. "Spindrift is right," Claire muttered, her voice raspy. "Coriolis is negligible. Density altitude is high." She reached up with her left hand, reaching over the scope to dial her turrets. Her right arm was strictly for holding the rifle into her shoulder. She cranked the elevation turret. Click, click, click. Then the windage. She had to hold deep into the wind. "I'm dialing 6 mils left," Claire said, holding another 2 on the reticle for the gusts. "I like it," Hayes said. "Send it when you have the lull." Claire settled into the pocket. She pulled the massive 35-pound rifle tight against her ruined shoulder. The pressure alone made her breath hitch. She dug her toes into the dirt, driving her body weight forward into the bipod to manage the impending recoil. She stared through the glass. The crosshairs hovered out in the empty desert, far to the left of the actual truck, waiting for the wind to blow the massive bullet back on course. She watched the mirage. It was flowing hard left. Then, for a fraction of a second, the boiling air stood up straight. The wind dropped. Now, Claire squeezed the trigger. The rifle erupted. The blast threw a violent cloud of dust over them. The recoil slammed backward like a sledgehammer. Claire's head snapped back slightly, and a sharp, blinding white light flashed behind her eyes as the titanium plate ground against her collarbone. She gasped. A ragged, involuntary sound, but she forced her eye right back into the scope, fighting through the concussion to spot her own trace. Through the glass, she saw the vapor trail of the massive bullet arcing high into the sky, cutting through the wind and dropping down toward the valley. 3.5 seconds of flight time. An eternity. Smash. Through the spotting scope, Hayes watched the front grille of the truck mock-up absolutely disintegrate. The .50 caliber armor-piercing incendiary round punched through the barrier, shattered the grille, and buried itself deep inside the simulated engine block, blowing a chunk of steel the size of a fist out the back. "Impact!" Hayes yelled, his voice cracking with excitement. "Center punch! You destroyed it!" Claire didn't celebrate. She quickly pulled the bolt back with her left hand, her right shoulder refusing to rotate, ejecting the casing, and shoved the bolt forward, chambering a second round in case a follow-up was needed. "Target destroyed! Cease fire!" the tower radioed. Claire let out a long, trembling breath. She took her finger off the trigger and let her head rest in the dirt. Her entire right arm was trembling violently, a physiological reaction to the trauma she was forcing it to endure. Footsteps crunched in the sand behind them. Instructor Miller stood there, looking down at the smoking Barrett and then at Claire. "Clear your weapon, Harper," Miller said quietly. Claire rolled onto her side, ignoring the spike of agony in her chest. She dropped the magazine, racked the bolt back, and visually inspected the chamber. "Clear," Miller nodded. He pulled a black Sharpie from his chest pocket and took the qualification scorecard attached to Claire's mat. He didn't say a word. He just checked the final box, signed his name with a jagged scrawl, and dropped the card onto her chest. "Pack your gear, Chief," Miller said. He looked at her, really looked at her, his eyes stripping away the rank, the gender, the injury, seeing only the lethal precision of the operator beneath it all. "You're qualified." He turned and walked away. Hayes reached over and grabbed the empty, smoking brass casing that had just ejected from her rifle. He tossed it onto her mat. "Hell of a shot, Chief." Claire picked up the heavy brass casing. It was still warm. She gripped it in her right hand, her fingers slowly wrapping around the metal. It hurt to make a fist. It hurt to breathe. But as she looked down at the signed scorecard, the pain didn't matter. The laughter from the morning felt like a lifetime ago, buried under the deafening echo of iron and the undeniable truth of a target destroyed. She had asked for the rifle, and now she owned it. If you found this story of resilience, grit, and the relentless pursuit of excellence inspiring, make sure to hit that like button. Don't forget to share this video with someone who needs a reminder that true strength isn't just physical, it's mental. Subscribe to the channel for more deeply human, action-packed stories like this one, and hit the notification bell so you never miss an upload. What did you think of Claire's final shot? Let me know in the comments below.